For those of you that saw me speak at EdCon, I apologize if some of this seems a bit redundant, but I think that there's a lot of interesting points that we could discuss. There were a bunch of good points made about universal authentication and transaction relays and all of these usability features. And I think we present like a slightly just more privacy considerate point of view. And I think that sort of to open up some of these discussions about what this means and how, if these things may be implementable and sort of, can we have them work with all these other standards? And can we sort of find a common ground in some least common denominator frameworks that we can use? So cool. And this isn't as much like technical. Again, my talk was just general about usability and where are we in the space right now. And so I think, like I said, I'll keep this short. But are we there yet for Ethereum? I think universally we've answered that over the last few days. If we didn't already know that, no, we're not there yet. There's significant limitations to us getting there, whatever that means. That sort of means a state where end users are using the platform. People don't have to worry about blockchains and underlying technology, and it sort of just works. And so, no, we're not there yet. And I think this question is sort of like, where are the users? And that's sort of the core of everything we're discussing today. It's like, can we make these systems usable without sacrificing some of the core tenets of the tech that we're building? Decentralization, privacy, security, trustlessness, all of these things. And so I think if we start to think about like, where are the users and what are the ways in which normal average people want to interact with these types of systems, it's like we really have to start thinking about people. And I'm just really going to reiterate some of the same messages you've heard, right? It's like not about designing for a key pair or a key store file that you download. It's about designing for the person that's using the tech and like what are their daily norms and like how are they experiencing this and like how does it present itself to them and what does it enable them to do? And I think like it's really easy for people to design for key pairs because that's how the tech was designed. That's how it works. And it's how you build a POC. And I think like building a dApp, at least from what we've learned and talking and building them and talking to people building them is like, it's hard. There are like 1,000,001 things to worry about, even like that aren't even related to the tech. And so designing and just sort of like implementing an identity system or designing for a key pair is easy, and it helps you get to a POC, and it helps you prove that this system you're thinking about designing works. Well, it does the things that you say it does, but does it really work yet? And I think that question becomes answered in can people use it? It only works if people can use it to achieve the things that they want to achieve. And so this is oversimplified, and I know security's not in there. You can kind of maybe put decentralization around security because they're not the same but related. And there's these trade-offs, right? I think in many ways when you design for key pairs and you're designing things for the developer and user, we all take for granted that decentralization matters, and we're okay with all this friction and sort of key pair silos and app silos that we're generating and user experience silos because decentralization is great and that's like the core foundation upon the tech we're building. But if we really want to move to more average people, to more normal use cases, to more scalable systems, we have to start thinking about these other things. And usability, I think, is clear. That's why we're all here. But I sort of want to double click on privacy because that is one of those things where it's like, I think the early crypto people have a higher inkling towards some of these privacy preserving systems. It's sort of like anonymity, pseudonymity, cryptonyms, like all of these things are familiar to them, not familiar to normal people. And so like with privacy, it's almost like you have to look out for a user that doesn't know what they're doing to begin with. Like you can't reasonably expect people to know how to manage where their data is stored, what it means to share this information with this bank, and whether or not I'm sharing it through a ZK snark proof or sharing the raw data. Like literally those things can't cross people's minds. And so when you actually are trying to design for other considerations besides decentralization, you have to look at the system holistically, and that's sort of what we're doing here, which is great, right? Like we should talk about standards. We should talk about how we set smart defaults for users and allow them to opt in and sort of give them the levels of control that they need. It's just how do we present that to them? And so really building a user management platform, which is sort of something that we should share. We should build this as a shared infrastructure because at the end of the day, like the vision that attracted me to Web3 and decentralization was that I could be who I am everywhere, the same. And so if we aren't building those types of systems, it's because we haven't built on top of a shared infrastructure. And if we don't do that, it's because we haven't come to terms on standards. We haven't decided to implement some things in some ways that are compatible with each other. And so yeah, like all of this stuff wraps itself up in this system of user-centric identity management throughout Web3. Doesn't matter which dApp I use, which network I'm on, where my data is stored, like on which device I'm authenticating with. It sort of just all wraps up nicely. And these are like, nothing in here I don't think hasn't been discussed, right? And so that's a good sign. That means we're all thinking about the same things. And these are specifically just about some of the on-chain features that we should consider when thinking about some of these identity systems. And so some identity standards around identity construction and identity models, there's probably not one. There's probably multiple implementations of identity standards that are use case specific. I think as long as they are constructed in a way that's interoperable, again, it shouldn't matter. I am going to tell you there's probably definitely not going to be one identity model that everyone will use for everything. So I think we should talk about the use cases for these standards we're proposing and what is the actual difference between them and not fighting for a standard. Authentication protocols. There's universal logins. There's Uport has whatever we call it, Connect and Selective Disclosure. There's Wallet Connect. There's all of these different things now. What is the least common denominator of functionality that they need to share? Again, the implementations on the wallet side can be slightly differently, but sort of the interface should be similar. Again, for some of these on-chain features, like we said, mobile Ethereum signatures and mobile Ethereum UX is important. And so with push notifications and QR codes, you're already starting to get some of these different transport mechanisms. So you may even think about adding some, like if someone doesn't want QR code scanning or to flip their camera around, or if someone doesn't want to receive a push notification, like maybe you use like the Google Authenticator code. You just like encrypt something and you enter a PIN and you retrieve it from something. And so you can find other ways to transport this data around, but the key is abstracting that from sort of the identity systems. It'd be cool if I'm like playing Gnosis and I place a bet on some markets and then I'm on the subway and I just get a push and it's like, hey, place your daily Gnosis bet, and I just like click it and it signs. And it's like interfaceless dApps. Like that's pretty cool. Okay. Yeah, pre-funded transactions, that's pre-funding, I guess is the wrong word, but transaction relays, basically abstracting gas from the user, signing a message, sending it to a fueling relayer who sends it to the network. Like we've discussed, I think there's a lot of interesting things that Alex is thinking about with you can pay for gas with any sort of tokens, which I think is really awesome. We hadn't necessarily thought about that, so we should talk about some of those things. Mobile Ethereum signatures, I think that's obvious. Key management on mobile devices is slightly more secure than it is on browsers, and so we can help with security there in rooting trust on a secure device. And pairwise user accounts, and this is sort of like a little thing that we're adding in. That's an on-chain feature that we implemented but isn't required, but we do it to improve privacy. And I think if there are two sort of like enemies of this on-chain model, it's like at one sense, if you put data on-chain forever, it's there and will be permanently targeted by people into perpetuity or for however long the blockchain promises to be in existence, even if it's encrypted. And so like, if the promise of the blockchain is that identity is persistent forever and it's encrypted with technology that we have today, like that doesn't add up to me. Like there's a vulnerability. Also GDPR and things. Like, okay, that's a whole nother case. And then off-chain, right? Like I think here, if we're just talking about on-chain use cases, we're talking really in that decentralization like persona, the person who cares, the decentralization engineer, the like crypto anarchist. But when we move towards usability and privacy, we naturally have to abstract some things away from the chain. Because when you do everything on chain, everything is permanent and auditable, and all the addresses and interactions and actions can be correlated between you forever. So it's really important to protect users, because at the end of the day, like they're not gonna know that if I use the same account on two dApps, that's dangerous. They won't remember where they used it. And so helping them understand what this means at various points in the user experience, I think is really important. And so whether those are icons to symbolize when you're sharing data publicly or privately, I think that was like recommended. I think that's cool, but helping people understand. Also, if we're storing data off-chain, like where does it live? How is it formatted? Like health data will probably have to follow a FHIR standard that already exists in the real world that we can just take. And there's going to be other data formats for other specific industries that like we don't reinvent, we should just adopt. And so if I'm a person and I'm controlling my health data, it needs to be formatted according to the standards set by the health body, not by the Ethereum community. And we should adopt those standards. And so we need to think about designing identity systems not only for Web3, but ones that bridge Web 3 and Web 2. Because when we're thinking about like the dApp landscape, and it's really hard for us to say now, it's my anticipation that like pseudonymous, pure decentralized dApps where I go and I'm an anonymous person, I transact with other generally anonymous people, and I pay for gas, and I can use Tor. Like, that's the equivalent of using Tor today. Like, but does everyone use Tor? Like, no. Because you can do it, and there are use cases for why you would want to use Tor. There are also use cases for why you want to use normal apps. And maybe I want to use an app and I generally trust it except that one exchange contract I just don't want to trust. So I'll put that on chain. And so this world of hybrid dApps where I'm passing out-of-band data to a server that sort of verifies my signatures on chain and uses that to authenticate me to transact with another smart contract, I think those are the models we're going to start to see. So not just pure dApp interactions, but hybrid data sharing interactions. And obviously, key management, wallet consent interfaces, like all required things if you're storing data off-chain, because now I need to not only sign Ethereum transactions, but also sign arbitrary data and do all these other things. Approve disclosures of that data to counterparties, et cetera. So really what this means is like we can build single sign-on systems for Ethereum dApps pretty easily. Like we can just sort of pass my address to the dApp. We can sort of connect these things through one single contract. We can do these things, but at the end of the day, they're not privacy preserving. And if those are properties we want to offer to users, then we should think about improving some of those mechanisms because users won't know to protect themselves. And in a couple years, when there's just like sort of a complete mess on chain, then we're going to have to solve it. And at that point, it may be too late. Because one thing about correlation is you can't undo it. Like once you do it, it's there forever. And so it's important that you design systems that sort of protect against this cross-pollination. And yeah, I mean, there's a marriage between usability and privacy. And like normally private systems aren't as usable, but also decentralized systems aren't usable. And so we have this like triangle of usability issues that we're trying to tackle. And so, yeah, I mean, these are two standards we're proposing. We can talk about them. They're basically just an alternative to 725 as a package. Because there's been so much talk about that, I think we should talk about the other models that are out there. We're also hiring. You can talk to us. I think we've talked about that. But yeah, and we're also on mainnet with Augur. It's been a cool experiment working with those guys. Like we had, for a long time, determined like what does it mean to go to mainnet for Uport? Like we didn't really know. And so when we started designing this request network authentication, request dApp authentication, where we implemented pairwise key pairs for each dApp that a user interacts with. If I just go to log on to a dApp on mainnet, it just automatically creates an account for me. And then I can fund it and use it in the same way that I would use anything else, except I as a user can ignore network and I can just log in. And I think that's sort of the world that we want to move to. It's like, I want to just log in and I don't want to like corrupt my privacy. And so if we can enable data sharing in this type of environment with multiple identities, that's sort of what we're going after. If I have an identity in Toshi and I have an identity in MetaMask, can I use the same data? And so that's the things that we're really trying to solve. And it's sort of in this hybrid space of on-chain and off-chain. I think whether in 5 or 10 years, like that's ultimately where the types of architectures that we'll see to be determined. But I think given the scalability and the properties in blockchains today, it seems to be the most viable near-term solution for us, at least. So yeah, this isn't a half an hour. This is only a 10-minute talk. But yeah, I'm open to questions and discussion because there's probably a lot in there. So thanks.
Now that I have time for more of these sort of fun conversations, thanks for coming. And I don't, sorry, like I'm just curious, like what's it like working with Jameson?
With who?
Jameson Lopp.
Who's that?
My bad. That's really embarrassing.
I was like, man, Uport must be growing fast.
So out of it, man.
Ask that question again in a few minutes.
Okay.
A couple minutes. I'm like, wow, we're hiring people I don't even know about.
Another more conventional.
I can totally get like what you like might think or what might be wrong with like the ERC 735, but like what do you think are the issues in like the 7725?
So for me, they conflate two sort of different notions of a registry and an identity.
Yeah.
And so they sort of combine them into one, and it only supports on-chain data stored in that identifier registry, right?
Well, I mean,
From what I understand.
yeah, I mean, like from my understanding, the 725 is really just like notion of key like handler, and that's it. There's like no notion of claim in it. And then the 735, that's like the kind of like the claim storage, the claim handler.
Oh, okay.
And well, it doesn't necessarily imply that data is like stored within the claim itself. It can just point to, I don't know, like IPFS or like anywhere else. But
where
like,
would that be stored in IPFS?
uh,
Encrypted on IPFS?
well, there is like the standard doesn't imply like what should be the storage, what should the storage look like. But like I agree, like there is what we already had a discussion before. I agree, like there are reasons why not to do it at all, because you can just get connected to like who do you interact with. But I was just wondering whether there is something inherently wrong with just the key handler part.
I think it's not just a key handler. It's really like claims and attestations combined to this. And I think the biggest concern I have is that people hear identity, and Fabian talks about, oh yeah, a little profile on the internet, like, oh, at least your name and that you're like where the country you're from and who you work for, like the stuff you have on Twitter, it's public anyway. And I think that's, in my eyes or in our eyes, like it leads to the fact that people think it's okay to put this stuff onto the blockchain. And if you now encourage people to do claims like, I was here today, I was in Toronto, I was at the event, and then I was somewhere else. So what you create is an extremely nice profile of someone on chain, and I think